Good evening, gentlemen and ladies, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, virtually the most acclaimed voice on all matters concerning security and defense of the country. I've had the pleasure of hearing him out at various fora. I've met him at various fora, and virtually it comes to the last word of defense when it is from Ambassador Chinoy. He's got a distinguished career of almost 4 decades, in fact, over 4 decades. He's been the ambassador to Mexico, ambassador to Japan. He's been the consul general at Shanghai. He was the consul general in Australia. He's had many other diplomatic positions, a vast career spanning 40 years. He's also on the Padma Awards selection committee. He has authored several books, and he's a regular voice on several fora, not just in India. He's an acclaimed speaker called to express his thoughts on India's perspective on defense and security across the world. So I'll leave the stage open to him. It's my honor, Ambassador, to welcome you. Please, the stage is yours.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Vikram Limse, for your very generous introduction. I also want to thank Mr. Vikram Bhatt, the director of the Bangalore International Center, for very kindly having arranged for me to speak here, and for the two of you to have invited me. I want to acknowledge the presence of a very distinguished senior colleague of mine, Ambassador Lata Reddy, who, among many other things that she has done in her long and distinguished career, was also the Deputy National Security Advisor. And that was a time when we worked together as a team. My 4 years in the National Security Council Secretariat overlapped with part of her tenure there. And I must say that we did a thoroughly good job, at least that's what I think, together as a team. I don't know what you wrote in my CR, but I think she wrote many good things. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to walk you through, over the next 35 to 40 minutes, through a bunch of slides, and try and tell you a few things about India's defense and security calculus and imperatives in the broadest possible manner. So I hope to cover as many issues as possible. The core of this presentation must begin with India's outlook, because today we have really entered an era in which our domestic policy is increasingly integrated to our external policy, and what happens in the external environment has a direct impact on our domestic environment and policies as well. So the core strategic outlook of India, in fact, is essentially to maintain our sovereignty and territorial integrity. I would say the foundational principle is to maintain stability on India's periphery, whether it is continental or maritime, and to use that stability to our advantage to focus on the core issue of economic growth and development, inclusive growth and development, to have good relations to the extent possible with our neighbors, and to ensure that we are able to, in fact, maintain a high growth trajectory and take our rightful place at the international high table. We face a number of continental and maritime threats, and these have to be constantly monitored. We have a pluralistic experience. Our democratic values, in fact, democracy itself has triumphed, as we have seen in our elections, the general elections. To my mind, that also was a scathing indictment of those that alleged democratic backsliding, so to speak. But that's a viewpoint that I want to emphasize with regard to our democratic structure. The point here is that while India has long inherited these core values of the Buddha and later the Mahatma Gandhi, and we subscribe to the policies of peace and non-violence, it does not prevent India from making choices, hard choices, in exercise of its hard power. And we have demonstrated that capacity as well. The world today is, of course, very complex, and I think every generation feels that the times in which they have lived were equally complex. But we do see that the international compact that was created after 1949, at the end of the Second World War, which is exemplified and symbolized by the international multilateral order in the form of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, which came much later after GATT. These structures are, in fact, rendered ineffective today because of major power contestation. And the broad compact that we had seen through the Cold War is also no longer available. In fact, there is no equilibrium in place today because of major power contestation, because of these new wars that are taking place. Many of them are protracted, enduring wars, as we have seen in Ukraine and now again in West Asia. And in this kind of broad ecosystem at the geo-economic and geostrategic level, where multilateralism itself is weakened, we see there's a greater trend towards multi-alignment or issue-based alignment. In fact, every country in the world today is exercising a modicum of strategic autonomy. For there is no single country in the world that is in a position to make its writ felt on all issues, in all geographies, at all times. And that era of the two superpowers wielding that sort of influence is no longer in place. The last we saw that was in the 1990s, when the United States was the only standing superpower left, the unipolar decade, so to speak. But that's also behind us. It is in this environment that middle powers, and mind you, when I refer to middle powers also, I'm speaking of a spectrum. Not all middle powers are equal. There's a broad spectrum of middle powers, and I'd put India at one of the topmost rungs in terms of middle to major powers, growing as we are at the fastest clip in the world, and expected to do so for a fairly durable length of time. We are obviously the fifth largest economy today and soon to be the third largest. So this is an environment in which we have seen that the multilateral order has been fundamentally shaken up. And I think China's rise is a fundamental contributor to this. There is a feeling that China has gamed the system, that China has derived undue benefits, that China is now a country on which a vast majority of countries have come to depend in terms of their supply chains. Dependence on a single geography, on a single country, obviously makes for tensions and stress points with regard to critical supply chains. There is a certain pushback that's taking place today against China. There is a certain rebalancing also that is evident in terms of the quadrilateral security dialogue or the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum or the maritime domain awareness that the Quad is engaging in. I would say that broadly speaking at the international level, regardless of the geography, one can analyze current contestation, current tensions, current friction on the basis of these 7 stress points. These are true of any geography that you pick today, whether it is Europe with regard to Ukraine or whether it is West Asia with regard to the ongoing war in Gaza. The first is trade. Now, mind you, trade is a fungible factor, and it's very difficult to put a lid on trade because trade is generally driven by structural differences between economies. Trade is also not conducted by, for example, South Bloc in India or Army headquarters or the Pentagon. It's normally carried out by business people, entrepreneurs, industrialists, based on structural differences. And therefore, it's difficult to control. This is one of the reasons why we have seen in recent years, despite tensions with China, almost every country that has friction with China has found its trade with China growing at a time when they are actually speaking of a China plus one policy. It is the second T of technology which actually lends itself to much greater concentrations of control, of manipulation, weaponization, and because technology, generally speaking, comes about as a result of vast investments, billions of dollars sometimes made by either big tech or governments, sometimes the both of them acting in tandem. And therefore, we have seen how technology is a space where the United States, for example, has been more successful in regard to eroding some of the ecosystem that has occasioned the rise of China, using Western technologies over the last 30, 40 years. We have seen tensions with regard to territory. Territorial disputes abound. Throughout the Indo-Pacific, we have seen how, whether it's our geography or further afar in Southeast Asia, in terms of the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Pacific, there are tensions and frictions with regard to territory. This is what, in fact, today divides the world almost quite hopelessly. We've seen that in regard to Ukraine, where Russia's obviously absorbed about 20% of Ukraine's territory, annexed through legislation, and not all of that is physically necessarily under Russian control. We've seen that sort of thing with regard to Israel, with regard to the West Bank, with regard to Gaza. In our own region, between India and China, India and Pakistan, territory is there as a fundamental factor for cleavages. Terrorism is something that should have united the world today, for everyone faces the threat of terrorism. But ironically, it's also something that divides the global community, primarily because there's no agreement with regard to what should be defined as terrorism. Are these supposed to be acts aimed at acquiring, for example, freedom? Are the terrorists defined or supposed to be defined as freedom fighters? And there are countries, primarily within the OIC, fundamentally countries like Pakistan, that differ. The problem now, the fly in the ointment, is that with regard to consensus building at the UN in terms of the Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee, the 1267 Committee, which deals with the global listing of global terrorists, we find that countries like China use their veto power, their privileged position in the UN Security Council to, in fact, prevent the logical listing of global terrorists, whether they belong to the JEM or the LET. We have seen that in our own experience in recent years. Tenets is essentially narratives, as in systems of governance, social, political, economic, cultural. And here the world is fundamentally divided today in terms of the liberal, open, democratic order on the one hand, and on the other hand you have the authoritarian, autocratic, single-party systems, mostly Marxist, communist. In fact, there is a kind of competition, contestation in terms of the efficacy of these systems. We've seen that during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, when at the beginning of that pandemic, China claimed to have a greater efficiency in dealing with the pandemic. Of course, that was disproved later as it went into a disastrous phase of zero COVID policy and the aftermath, which in fact dampened its economic growth, repercussions and ripples of which are still to be seen and felt through the global economy. The next T is transparency. Today, the world is kind of arming itself. Budgets, defense budgets are growing in every part of the world, notably in the Indo-Pacific. And it's a factor where you need to press the kind of pause button and think about it, because it's very easy to read the growing capacities of adversaries, but it's very difficult to read their motivations and intentions. In regard to India and China, for example, we can always do the bean counting with regard to the number of ships they have, the number of subsurface vessels they have, the number of artillery they have at their disposition along the line of actual control, but you don't know much about intentions and motivations. And at the end of the day, that is what counts. So transparency is lacking, and it makes for that final factor of lack of trust. There's absolutely no trust today in the global system. Now, China's rise is, in my view, something that's remarkable. It's one of those rare examples of a country having fundamentally changed from the time that I first went as a young officer from Hong Kong. After having done a stint in Delhi, I was in Hong Kong. And in 1984, I went on my first posting to the People's Republic. It was a very different country then. And in a matter of less than 4 decades, China has gone on to become the world's second largest economy. In fact, in terms of PPP, the world's largest economy. In fact, it has demonstrated unusual capacity to have what is otherwise a state-led economy, but decentralized at the level of the provinces, where the provinces have in fact made for good competition among themselves, created great capacities. Some of that is felt today in the export of the Belt and Road Initiative, where excess capacities, Chinese standards are being pushed out to the rest of the world. So it's an unusual phenomenon of the rise of a country in a very short span of time, in a telescope period of, say, 40 years. It's also built alongside its economic capacities, enormous military capacities. And that's where the rub lies. China is basically an anti-status quoist power. Now, it's a fact that it helicoptered into the UN Security Council in 1971 when the Republic of China, that is Taiwan, was shown the door for larger reasons to do with geostrategic requirements of the day, when the United States wanted to have a modus vivendi with the People's Republic in order to deal with a Soviet Union that was racing ahead in terms of its military power, atomic power, its space power, etc. But the fact is that China, in fact, occupies today a very privileged position in the existing global order. So my argument today is that China is not that anti-status quoist a power that it would want to dismantle the existing global order, for it is the existing global order which has occasioned its rise and which continues to give China a privileged position. At the same time, what China resents is the fact that in this existing global order, the agenda setting continues to be handled by the Western powers, because it is they who created this post-Second World War multilateral order. And it is there that China is also parallelly creating its own, should I say, constituency, parallel global structures such as the AIIB, the New Development Bank of the BRICS, and it has also got its own sovereign projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, or the three great global initiatives, that is the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Cultural Initiative. Now, I would say that China has failed to realize that as it grew phenomenally, while it continued to expect the rest of the world to adjust to its phenomenal rise, it has actually fundamentally failed to adjust to or respond to the relative rise of others. For while China grew in these 40 years, 45 years, it's not as if the rest of the world was at a standstill. There were other countries also that were making their own progress and growing, albeit at a lesser pace. And this is where China is insensitive or indifferent to the requirements of others. It expects the world to fall in line with regard to its core interests, with regard to the One China policy, but it's not quite willing to give that same attention and reciprocate with regard to the core interests of others. It expects the world to open up markets, but it does not give the same access to its own market. It champions itself as a leader of globalization, or a champion of the liberal trading order, but it's not ready to respect the same rules-based liberal international order which facilitated its rise. So we have a problem here because China's rise is increasingly a major disruption for the rest of the world, and there are some tensions which may lie ahead when it comes to their key anniversaries that are showing up. 2027 is going to be the centenary of the founding of the PLA. And that's a time when a little bit of muscle flexing must be anticipated. Or 2035, when they want to create a modern, PLA or a modern society and declare China to be a modern country. Or 2049, when they want to achieve their second centenary goal of making China, through the China dream, a strong and modern nation. India-China relations have always seen their ups and downs, as you are all aware. I'm not even talking about the colonial period when India and China, in fact, to my mind, were not really neighbors. For we, during the British times, had frontiers, so to speak, with China, and there were buffer states in between that were not always, under China. In fact, China was a latecomer to Tibet. In fact, the first footprint of the Qing in Tibet came about after the death of the 6th Dalai Lama, around 1720 or so, as a result of an internecine succession issue. which gave them a perch and a toehold to insert themselves in terms of a modicum of a presence across Tibet. Anyhow, post-1949, when the Chinese moved into Xinjiang, fundamentally the PLA took over Xinjiang. In 1950, when they went into Tibet and took that place over, we find that we are neighbors, geographical neighbors. And overnight, there are two new nations midwifed around the same time, looking to establish their national identities. And you are aware that national identities will come from borders and a sense of geography to which you belong. We have seen how Galwan, after all these ups and downs, we had managed to put in place a number of protocols and agreements, confidence-building measures. Most of my professional life in the foreign ministry went trying to do just that, building CBMs with China. I headed the expert group of diplomatic and military officials that negotiated the clarification and confirmation of the LAC and the CBMs between 96 and 2000. So I can tell you that Galwan was a body blow to all those CBMs that we had tried to create. It wrecked the relationship. India's response was robust. We, of course, had to match militarily the disposition and the deployments that the Chinese had made. We also had to take into account the fact that they have a much larger GDP, a much larger military power that makes for asymmetry. But in today's world, it is possible to bridge absolute gaps in national power through asymmetrical means also. And so therefore, India did what it could to mirror China's deployments on the border, gun for gun, troop for troop. And there are 60,000 troops on either side facing one another. It was a strong message to China that we will do what it takes to protect our sovereignty and territorial integrity. I must say that dialogue has continued, but it's not of an extraordinarily high quality, the dialogue that takes place at the political, military, and diplomatic level. The defense and foreign ministers have been meeting their counterparts occasionally. Our Prime Minister and Xi Jinping also had some brief exchanges in the course of the Bali summit in 2022, later the BRICS summit in South Africa last year. The corps commanders on the ground have met 21 times, and the working mechanism for consultation and coordination, that is the rehashed expert group which I led 28 years ago, is now called the WMCC. It's led by a JS level officer from the Ministry of External Affairs. They've been meeting. SRs means the special representatives. The National Security Advisor on the Indian side is our special representative for these talks. They've met 22 times, but the last was in 2019. And that also indicates to you that we do not quite engage one another today, certainly not in the aftermath of Galwan. The boundary issue is a major problem and factor in our ties. And there are current standoffs that continue. These may not be as tense standoffs as we had seen in the immediate aftermath of Galwan, but we still have a couple of friction points. For example, in Demchok in the deep south, in the western sector, in Ladakh, or further north in the Depsang Bulge area, there are sort of troops, and we've not been able to disengage at these friction points. Now, the core issue here is that the Chinese say 4 years after Galwan, it is no longer an emergency situation, that India should reconcile itself to the fact that the boundary or such disputes or such tensions are in fact a small part of the relationship, and that we must continue to have normal ties. We must resume normalcy in our relations. Our point is that while we have a bilateral dispute, while we can normalize the existence of a bilateral dispute in our ties, we can also normalize the fact that it may take time to resolve this through peaceful negotiations. We are not in a position to normalize the potential for further bloodshed, which exists at the moment because of those friction points and inability to disengage. So there is a fundamental, sort of drift apart here, and we believe that China must do all it can to first disengage, appropriately at these remaining points. Pakistan, I think, is India's most difficult relationship, and it's a perennial problem because no matter what we do, there is the deep state in Pakistan, and particularly the Pakistan army, that in fact we are the raison d'etre for their existence, their budgets, their being in power in Pakistan, and so therefore we continue to remain the other or the enemy. And there is also this rising tandem between China and Pakistan that is of a growing nature and should attract our attention even more. They formed an axis, a kind of tandem in the aftermath of the resigning of Article 370 in particular. I also mentioned to you earlier their tandem with regard to the listing of terrorists. In the end, China is also prone to regard Pakistan as an albatross around its neck because of its disastrous economy and the kind of problems that they have, having nurtured terrorists over the decades. They are themselves at a receiving end. The Chinese are also at a receiving end, particularly in the north and the deep south in Balochistan. And so therefore, this is something that we take note of in our what we call defense and security calculus. The nexus, of course, is built around containment of India. And Pakistan is, of course, used by China as a state that can provide outreach to the OIC. It is an Islamic country. It is something that abuts its soft underbelly in Xinjiang. And Pakistan, in fact, has done a lot to reassure China with regard to the presence of ETIM, that is East Turkestan Independence Movement, terrorists that had based themselves out of Fatah. So therefore, there is this emerging arc of cooperation and collusion between them. In the Indo-Pacific, as you can see, all the oceanic spaces are conjoined. In fact, they were always conjoined. And the colonials, in fact, knew of this the best. That is how they operated, whether it was the British, whether it was the Italians and the Germans who also were present in the peripheral areas of the Indian Ocean during the age of exploration and the age of colonization. We have seen how, in fact, a lot of traffic took place during those times as well. So the Indo-Pacific is itself not a new idea. It's, in fact, a statement of fact and reality. And it's a very busy place, as you know. Some of the largest sort of economic powers are in this region: China, Japan, India. Most dynamic ones are in this region as well, like Korea and the Asian tigers. Most populous democracy being India, the largest Muslim country being Indonesia. Some of the biggest and busiest ports are there. Some of the largest military expenditures are to be seen in this part of the world. And a full 50 to 60% of the global population, depending on how you define the geography, in fact, is resident here. The short point of this slide is to tell you that the Asia-Pacific is a concept that is today outdated. It's, in fact, had its shelf life and is out of currency today, in my view. The Asia-Pacific is a term that came about as a result of cooperation between the world's largest and most dynamic economy, that's the United States of America, making itself available to the resurgence of, for example, Japan from the ashes of the Second World War, and thereafter the Asian tigers also had their growth spurts by accessing this one large economy across the waters of the Pacific. Later, from the late 70s and 80s onwards, it was the People's Republic of China that benefited with the same connect. And this continued till the end of the last century. So it's a very important concept, Asia-Pacific. But it's no longer relevant because beginning this century, this growth and prosperity has spread to a much larger geography. And today the Indo-Pacific is staple. It's the main currency. It has agency today. It is the more representative, more inclusive, more open, more democratic concept. where you acknowledge that growth and prosperity is no longer the prerogative of a small geography in Northeast Asia or certain parts of East Asia, but that other countries in Southeast Asia, in South Asia like India, Bangladesh, all the way up to the east coast of Africa, have a right to grow and in fact are among the most rapidly rising economies today. So the Indo-Pacific is here to stay, ladies and gentlemen, and everything that happens in these parts is interconnected today. Internal security in India today is extremely important. As I said, it connects us to what's happening within the country and some of the choices that we make externally, especially with regard to neighbors, have a lot to do with our internal issues. Insurgency in the Northeast, for example, or left-wing extremism in certain areas in India, cross-border terrorism, radicalization. These are the four main internal security challenges. I would say that broadly speaking, compared to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the situation in the Northeast is in fact better today. Broadly speaking, we have seen how Sikkim, Tripura, Mizoram are entirely free of insurgency. And while this problem has not been resolved completely, we have achieved a great deal through ceasefire agreements and dialogue with a number of these groups, and that process continues. Left-wing extremism is a major threat in the Red Corridor, but that too, in fact, there's been a sharp decline in terms of the absolute statistics, a number of incidents, number of casualties that our security forces have taken, sharp decline there. Counter-radicalization, I would say, has also been fairly effective. I mean, despite all that's happened in the world, we have seen how in terms of homespun, homegrown terrorism, we have very few. There are very few misguided Indians who might have ever participated, in operations alongside, for example, ISIS, or gone to different parts of the world to take part in jihad, as compared to, for example, France, which would rank very high. Even countries like the UK have contributed many more people. Maldives is right there at the top in terms of its small population, the total number of people who have gone there, from there to other parts of the world, especially in the AFPAC region or in the broader region of the Levant, to, in fact, be part of jihad and all that. And cross-border terrorism, of course, continues, but it's been largely contained because of the exemplary manner in which the Indian Army has also created its cordons and the kind of work that is being attempted on the ground in Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, that does not address the issue of Pakistan making efforts, the use of drones now to drop not just munitions and things like that, but to drop drug consignments through the Punjab border on the Indian side, which is then taken to J&K and used to create local funding, to create drug addiction, to promote this nefarious agenda there. Coastal security is also extremely important for India. When you look at our future, when you look at our defense and security paradigms, this vast coastline of 7,500 kilometers, our long island chains, and of course the wake-up call came because of the 2008, the dastardly attack on the big metropolis of Mumbai, in which so many people lost their lives. Of course, Mumbai was not the only city attacked. We have seen some of these terrorist attacks and incidents even in cities like Mumbai, in Bangalore in the past. Today, there is much greater coordination between the various agencies, be it the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Customs, Marine Police, the creation of coastal police stations, the revamping of the mandate given to each of these agencies. The Customs operate far out today in the territorial waters as compared to the past. So also the Coast Guard, which has been given the mandate to move up all the way, to guard the territorial waters. Sometimes they go further ahead into international waters as well. And so tracking, registration of illegal fishing boats, biometric identity cards, the national AIS system, the sensors, the static radars, etc., coastal radars, these are in place and providing a much better picture. When you integrate the data that comes from these shore-based and offshore and and space assets, etc., you get a much better maritime domain picture, which is often referred to as white shipping, where we also collaborate with a number of other countries. Cyber threats are growing, as you know. I must say, Ambassador Lata Reddy has done a fair bit of work on that at the international level, and I congratulate you for having done that. We have seen how COVID-19 has actually pushed the world towards the online platform. I mean, all of you can look back just a few years and recall that before COVID, you didn't really spend so much time online. In fact, today we tend to do this in hybrid mode, and everybody is busier as a result of that. But one of the biggest threats today is in the cyberspace. And there is a need to protect not only our critical infrastructure, but also individual citizens who are vulnerable to hacking, vulnerable to online cheating. And we've seen how, despite our best efforts to ban Chinese apps, etc., there are a number of online schemes where scamsters, often associated with such powers, are skimming the savings of people in India through spurious, specious loan schemes, etc. So therefore, we need to be more cognizant of this as we move into AI. Fundamentally, artificial intelligence is going to drive us all into a future in which we will have to rely more on lethal autonomous weapons. The key question to my mind is whether such weapons will always be systems or will become systems where the human being can no longer override the codes. But that's a larger debate, isn't it, about whether AI is soon going to take over when it goes past human intelligence, whether it will actually control human beings in the future. Our defense requirements are huge. Do I have another 10 minutes or so? I'll try to wind up as quickly as possible. The point here is that India must guard its vast continental borders. It must also guard equally well its coastline. In many ways, the coastline being 100% sovereign for us is still a last mile area, because these are accessible from the high seas, as you know, in dinghies and in fishing craft, local country craft, as we saw during the 2008 attack. The seas are also much more difficult to scrutinize and to monitor, because you need much more of technology. These are not populated areas where you can use terra firma to put in place a number of other means to monitor the space. So guarding the land and sea frontiers is a huge challenge, and technology is something that we require today. Atmanirbhar Bharat, I just want to mention something here. This is often misunderstood because people think this is some kind of an autarkic or an atavistic vision where we no longer want to cooperate with the rest of the world. We are going into some kind of a North Korea-like juche policy where we'll attempt to do everything ourselves or reinvent the wheel, and far from it. The way I look at it is that Atmanirbhar Bharat is simply a desire program that is aimed at making us more self-reliant, not necessarily self-sufficient. Also to make sure that our dependence on global supply chains is not extreme, not such that erodes our strategic autonomy, the choices that we have to make. If there are wars that we have to fight, we cannot be at the mercy of third parties with regard to, say, ammunition. I mean, we've been through this during Kargil, for example. We had the Bofors gun, which was doing very well, but we didn't have the adequate, stocking of the 155 mm artillery shells. And I recall that there was an urgent sort of scurrying of the world to see where we might get such shells from. Ultimately, they were bought from South Africa. So this is not an isolationist policy. It is aimed at making ourselves more autonomous in terms of the choices that we can exercise without being dependent on third parties. India is still a net importer of arms and defense equipment, but domestic manufacturing is growing. We have set up these industrial corridors in UP and Tamil Nadu. There is growing partnership between government and private industry, academia, research organizations. These schemes, people like you, Vikram, would be familiar with all these schemes, IDEX, etc. innovations for defense excellence. And this is, in fact, growing by the day as we speak. More money is being poured into this by government than in any other area. And you might also be aware that because of this, the stock market for defense companies shows a particular trend. That's because we are providing at the government level grants and new rules and regulations with regard to R&D, etc. So broadly speaking, the vision is to make India a leading country in defense supply chains, including in aerospace. Naval shipbuilding, we have a head start because the Naval Design Bureau has always done well. Now the Army Design Bureau and the others are also trying to do as much as they can. In the in regard to the Air Force, it's difficult because these platforms are fully built platforms that we tend to buy. So it's not as if we will design a part of the Rafale, but nothing stops us from defining our own, designing our own LCA and making it a very successful aircraft, the Tejas, for example. The turnover of $25 billion is a huge target that we have. Exports of 50,000 crores by 2028 is what Mr. Rajnath Singh has recently announced. We want to be part of the global supply chain. We want to encourage the manufacturing of subsystems and parts also in India. We want to create Indian IP, and some of these focus areas are mentioned here. Now, the point here is that there are these positive indigenization lists that you heard of. These include items that otherwise are listed by the services for procurement or by the DPSUs, and more than 5,000 have been now sort of identified under these positive indigenization lists. And the whole idea is that these should be made in India and do what it takes to create the ecosystem to encourage our own domestic industry to get there. We are also making sure that 75% of our procurement budget today is available for domestic procurement. And of that, we are also earmarking 25% of that 75% entirely for purchases from the private sector. So you can see how the trend is moving towards domestic procurement and notably from the private sector. Defense innovation and R&D are at a premium today. We want to encourage DRDO also to do more in this regard. We want to encourage private industry to do more. There are schemes like the Technology Development Fund, for example, where original limits of 10 crores have been increased to 50 crores. But more needs to be done to ensure that the 50 crores are actually disbursed and available to the private sector. 25% of the defense R&D budget, as you're aware, during 23-24, it was announced by the finance minister that 25% of the R&D budget will be earmarked for academia and private industry. We are also trying to work alongside with countries like the United States and France, with the US in particular, the initiative on critical and emerging technologies. In fact, Jake Sullivan, the US counterpart of Mr. Doval, is visiting India, and they've been talking about expediting some of these arrangements that were arrived at last year. So anyhow, defense sector is also seeing a transformation in terms of the space that is now available for foreign direct investment. 74% under the automatic route, but where we need technologies and where technologies can be transferred to us through the sort of clearance route, we are permitting 100% now. And there's one good example of Saab having come into the defense corridor in Uttar Pradesh to make the Carl Gustav M4 rocket system, which is otherwise an infantry weapon, but used by our army and the paramilitary forces. I want to end with broadly this idea of civil-military fusion. That's very important for Atmanirbhar Bharat. It's very important for our strategic autonomy. It's very important for what we want to achieve between now and 2047, this Amrit Kal period, which is supposed to lead us towards achieving our own dream of a Viksit Bharat. To get there, we will require to do much more together. And I have identified, in my view, 5 fundamental planks for the roadmap. The first is integration of the functioning of the 3 services and their resources. This is already underway in terms of the efforts that are being made to create for example, the theater commands, the fact that there is a CDS already in place since 2019. And integration is way beyond jointness. In fact, integration implies integration of structures. Jointness implies jointness of purpose for certain operations while maintaining your own identity. So don't confuse jointness with integration. Integration is something that we must seek between the 3 services, Army, Navy, Air Force, and in terms of their resources, training, etc. Jointness of purpose and seamless coordination between the armed forces and paramilitary forces. This is very important. Everyone needs to be on the same page today with regard to India's defense and security imperatives. You cannot have the paramilitary forces working at cross purposes. Today, in fact, everybody is part of this last mile defense and security paradigm. That includes customs, for example. And we must make them aware of what is happening with regard to China or what's happening with regard to Pakistan. They shouldn't be looking at their local issues in a myopic manner. The third is jointness between the armed forces as end users and the defense manufacturing establishment, such as the DRDO, the Ordnance Factory Board, which has been converted, corporatized, where the 41 factories have now been, recast in 7 different, corporatized structures. And these must learn to talk to each other much more. The jointness between end users, that is the armed forces, and industry and academia is also extremely important. And lastly, the common vision and convergence of action between the armed forces, the uniformed services in general, that includes the paramilitary forces, and the civilian bureaucracy. And they must not be working at cross purposes. If we can achieve these 5, then I should think we are well on to our way on the path of progress. The new wars of tomorrow are going to be very different from the conventional wars of the past. We have to look at hybrid wars, asymmetric wars, low-intensity wars, enduring and protracted wars of the type that we are looking at right now. The use of cheap technologies to bridge the absolute gaps that I talked about. This option is available to states and non-state actors. We saw that in the case of the Hamas, for example, how they inundated Israel's famous and fabled surveillance systems with very low-cost drones, dropping a single, for example, load of a single grenade on a very sophisticated camera or a watchtower. And that's the end of that. Or using bulldozers to take down the fence, or using paragliders to get in there. So we have seen how cheap rockets, enough of them made in garages and backyards, can actually inundate something like Israel's Iron Dome as well. And every generation has seen a revolution in military affairs. I mean, even the machine gun for its time during the Boer War and later in the First World War changed the nature of trench warfare. I mean, nobody was in a position to mass troops and rush down open fields with bayonets fixed, because a machine gun had been invented that could mow down hundreds of people in a matter of seconds. The airplane created that RMA revolution in military affairs, where in the First World War you would have individual pilots, open canopy, dropping, hand-dropped, ordnance on mass troops below. During the Second World War, you saw how tanks and mobile warfare, the armored personnel carriers came about and created new dimensions. The first of the unmanned rocket systems were being experimented with by the Germans, and later, of course, all this resulted in the jet engine and so much more. So we are today looking at an era of beyond visual range weapons, UAVs, drones, rockets, loitering munitions, hypersonic missiles, shorter, what you call, sensor to shooter, kill chains. And in all this, cyber will play a role, AI will play a role. And I don't think we are going to get there if we don't fundamentally reform our structures to make sure that all this talent that's available in places like Bangalore and Hyderabad, these corridors, where private industry can play a role, where academia, scientists, and research people can play a role. Unless we involve them, we're not going to be able to put our act together. As I said, the role of private individuals is growing. One fine example is Elon Musk with his Starlink satellite system. I mean, he can even take a call on whether or not the West should use this system, to challenge Russia's presence in Crimea. He took a call on that and said no. And elsewhere he has taken a call to say, yes, we will make Starlink available to the ordinary Ukrainian soldier who, while trying to fight a World War I-like trench warfare, conflict, is now increasingly part of this network-centric, ecosystem. So the private sector and private individuals will play a big role. Incidentally, while I have the floor here, I have to brag about my little book that came out last year. This is World Upside Down. It has a lot on China. It has a lot on the boundary question, on the great change, the flux that's taking place. And I'm happy to announce that while this is something that was published by HarperCollins and available today, but my next book is coming out next month. I hope you will find time to pick it up somewhere. Maybe I'll send you the details later. But a very big thank you to you for listening to me so patiently. And I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Absolutely riveting. Each time I hear, there's a new perspective. Interesting. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. On the queue, I'll just take 2 or 3 questions because there are many people waiting to ask, get into the Q&A session. So a couple of things. One is from an industry background, because I come from there, almost 300-400% growth rate in all the defense stocks. So things are looking good out there. But a slightly philosophical question. I think the West, if you see the entire technology industry can trace its roots to the defense industry, Bay Area and specific to the Oppenheimer project, including the chip industry to, the guy shooting internet and shooting wrong bombs in Vietnam, whatever. It's a bad history out there. But on one side, it's that. And on the other side, the pharma industry drives the pandemic, they say. The defense industry sometimes drives the war. Does that really happen? Is it popular folklore or it's all gobbledygook? And what is that tipping point where, things can change from the good to the bad and then ugly, and where should we be looking at it?
So I think it's not quite happened in India yet because we simply don't have that kind of a global defense industry. But where defense industry has achieved the pinnacle of technological success, it is very much a case of industry wanting to sell their wares, wanting to try them out in different wars. And that is to be expected because of the overhang of the mercantile principle. They are driven by profit. They have invested billions of dollars in different kinds of technologies. And so obviously they want an ROI on it. So I think it's practical to accept that fact that defense manufacturers, the big ones that dominate, will always want their products to sell. They will look for opportunities to insert themselves and to market their products as being superior to somebody else's. I think we see this sort of messaging also in India, that what we have is not good enough, what we are procuring is not good enough, we should procure only certain types of equipment if we are to actually fight the wars of the future. I think the answer also lies somewhere in between, because not everybody needs, the acme of technology to deal with their defense and security imperatives. You can make do with
policy-wise robust to kind of track that change happening and kind of prevent
So I think it's
happening?
I would agree with the proposition that suggested that, because we have tried to broad base our defense acquisitions. We are trying to seek an appropriate balance and equilibrium between domestic procurement and foreign procurement. Within the foreign procurement, we are trying to balance between, for example, traditional suppliers like Russia, earlier the Soviet Union, to now sourcing from multiple others like the United States or France. On technology, we have chosen other partners, yet other partners like Israel. On the domestic front also, we are broad-basing. It's not only DPSUs. It's not only government companies, but we want to source from the private sector as well. So I think a good balance is being sought today.
It's heartening to note that. The other thing, the most talked about is nowadays, most popularized by General Rawat, is the 2.5 front war. So we've heard of two in your slides. Your thoughts on the other half? Who constitutes that half?
As in terrorism?
Yeah, 2.5. What does it mean? Can you define it specifically?
I mean, broadly speaking, I would imagine it's China, it's Pakistan, and the non-traditional security threats that we face with regard to terrorism.
Is that internal threats, the 2.5, the other half?
No, I don't think so. I think it's the half would be, non-traditional threats, and typically symbolized by the very large, omnipotent threat of terrorism. In this case, of course, cross-border terrorism. I mean, this is what you call low-intensity, below the threshold kind of warfare that India has to face. It's not an open declaration of war. It's not cross the Rubicon where it would trigger an all-out war. But that apart, I mean, to my mind, it's not a question of whether it's 2.5 or whether it's 2. India must be prepared at all times to deal with its continental and maritime challenges. It must be prepared to deal with the internal security challenges that I also recounted for you in one of my slides. The way to do this is through, equipment, firstly, soldier support systems, also a great deal of homegrown research and development. We must also make sure that there is greater integration and jointness, civil-military fusion, and whether it's 2.5 or whether it's 3, whether it's 2, we will be able to deal with them.
Just that the term has been popularized of late, so therefore I asked. One last question before I throw it open. In today's world, does it make sense to be part of these groups? Like you said, APAC is history now. Likewise, there are a lot of these defense and security groupings. I mean, we've got Quad and other things happening right now. How much is that relevant in today's date? Can India as a country be a part of these kind of groups by, does it compromise its bilateral interest? And how important is it nowadays in today's day and age?
I don't think participation in groups such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which incidentally is not a treaty-based alliance partnership, and nor is it a declared defense grouping, nor for that matter is the Malabar a declared sort of naval alliance, so to speak. But participating in one or more of these does not in any way erode from the strategic autonomy that we wish to seek for ourselves. For that matter, at the height of the non-aligned movement, when India was unabashedly promoting non-alignment as one of the leaders after 1961, we, in fact, the very next year, sought defense equipment when Ambassador Galbraith was the US ambassador, and Prime Minister Nehru had written to President Kennedy asking for fighter aircraft, for other equipment, including personnel, to manage these systems in order to enable India to deal with the Chinese aggression against India. So to my mind, being non-aligned, which was in my view an expression of strategic autonomy of that time, did not prevent India from engaging in issue-based alignment or cooperation with one of the two superpowers. And precisely a decade later, again non-alignment, which was still very much alive then and kicking, did not prevent India from engaging the other superpower, once again in issue-based alignment. When the Americans kind of sent a strong message to India by sending their 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal India, which was engaged with operations in East Pakistan, which led eventually to the birth of Bangladesh, went and signed a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation with the Soviet Union. So I would say that India has, whether it was non-aligned stance then or its strategic autonomy today, nothing prevents India from engaging in issue-based alignment or cooperation in a multi-alignment environment.
And there are no forces acting to the contrary because of these multilateral alignments, is it?
No, I don't think so. In fact, India is too large a country, too large an economy, too large a population to be manipulated by anyone in any direction. I think so far we've done quite well.
Interesting. Thanks. I think I'm not going to hog much time because there are a lot of people waiting with questions. So we've got, at least 20 minutes to 25 minutes, and we can open the house. Yeah? Yeah, that's why everywhere. So, Madam, can I start with you?
You want to say something.
We have an expert here either way. So I'll start from the left and then, not ideologically left. I'm saying just on that side. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Srivatsa, and I would like to ask a question based on the Make in India and the Atmanirbharta point that you made. So it's great that we have 3 make categories, and the government has been really good to do with that. But how would you suggest that we improve the funnel where the density is headed more towards make 3 category, which is just entering joint ventures and transfer of technologies, but rather invert that funnel where we have more attention on make 1, which is critical tech, and make 2, which is import substitution. So what are your thoughts on, and like the government should put in efforts to reverse this funnel?
Well, I think DAP 2020 is something that will have to be reviewed by next year. And a lot of what you are saying today is being considered. I'm no doubt that government will consider these issues. But I'm happy to inform you that IDSA has taken the initiative before anybody else has to run with this. And we've already engaged a very large number of people in government and in the private sector to see what kind of ideas they wish to give for DAP 2020 in terms of the next iteration. So I'm sure make 1, make 2, and all the issues that you're talking about, also the 50% indigenous content, the manner in which this is achieved today, far from perfect in the eyes of many. The fact that we may still not be getting the right kind of technologies, how the 50% indigenous content is subject to a certain degree of packaging by various companies. If you are in industry, you'll know what I'm referring to. All this will come up in the context of DAP 2020. I think we've got about a year, and I decided about 3 months ago that I'll run with it and engage the widest possible spectrum of people. In my view, frankly, even before government has started work on this. So in fact, I was amazed to see that about 20 people from the MOD willingly came over because the first of the brainstorming sessions was taking place not in MOD, but at IDSA. And that's our job. I think IDSA's role is to do a little bit of deep thinking, not wait for others to suggest these things. So we are also working hard on drones, for example. We want to see what more we can do. The airworthiness bill, for example, on that also we have some people working on it.
Good evening, Mr. Chinoy. My name is Madhav Kaushal. It's a privilege to listen to you, and all the best for your upcoming book. My question is, what do you see is the likelihood of LOC turning into an international boundary, and do you think it can bring lasting peace in the subcontinent? And secondly, what do you think, how can we recover our soft power, which has been affected by the discourse of rising illiberalism in India, etc.?
I mean, these are very two very ends of spectrum. Nothing in common between these two. So as far as the LOC is concerned, LOC is not the international boundary, and nor do I think it is possible to conceive of the LOC as an international boundary, because India obviously claims the whole of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And India also claims what has been ceded by Pakistan to China through their so-called and illegal boundary agreement of 2 March 1963, a full 5,180 square kilometers ceded by Pakistan to China in the Shaksgam Valley, which is the Trans-Karakoram tract. And we claim that, don't we? Our maps very clearly claim that after 2019, after Article 370 was abrogated, we have published maps once again to that effect. So I don't see how the LOC can ever be, it's exactly what it is. It's a line of control. And it's not the ceasefire line, because the ceasefire line got converted into the LC or LOC after the Shimla Agreement of 1972. As far as soft power is concerned, I do not see any erosion. I see a lot of disinformation also out there. And for me, it's objectionable, because I take pride in our democratic elections. For me, regardless of individual political ideology or your loyalties or allegiance, the fact of the matter is that this was the world's largest fair and open election that took place, and the people demonstrate their will through the ballot box. So I think the recent elections, in fact, are a great and resounding reaffirmation of India's democracy, its democratic processes, its checks and balances, the biggest of which comes through the will of the people. So I don't see how that has eroded our soft power. In fact, today, India is the one country, in my view, that is willing to point the global community in the direction of a values-based future. Not a mercantile future, not a profit-oriented future, not a big tech-driven future, not a future driven by the merchants of death in terms of the large defense manufacturing industries around the world. It is a country that is actually speaking about showing a different kind of way forward to reconcile differences through dialogue. We have tried to do that with regard to our own problems with neighbors, but also with regard to what's going on in the world around us. So if anything, I think India has a fair chance of pointing the world to a new direction, which is different from the binary choices that most countries today are forced to choose from. It's either China or the United States. It's either the West or, the tandem between Russia and China. We are willing to come out there and propose a third choice. But that choice can also translate into benefits for India in terms of our economic participation, in terms of our exports, in terms of our ability to do capacity building for others. In the bargain, develop a relationship in which we bring in technologies from elsewhere. We can actually become a new fulcrum for established powers also to make themselves more acceptable in different geographies where India has greater credibility. For example, if France going into Africa alone will be probably seen as a colonial power. If France going into Africa in tandem with India in the Francophone areas is likely to be seen less as a colonial power. That applies to Australia in its backyard in the South Pacific also. If India comes in, then it's often seen as a do-gooder that brings in, sort of high-impact community development projects, albeit low cost in terms of the type that we did in Afghanistan, $1 million or so, street lighting in Belize, or doing something in, the Pacific region for island nations, whether it's Micronesia, Melanesia, or Polynesia. I mean, India is readily accepted. So we should, I think, chin up, be optimistic. Nothing has happened to our soft power. In fact, we are the ones left standing there with soft power. Everybody else is simply exercising hard power, thoughtlessly, mindlessly.
I think if hands can go up, then it's easy for us to choose. Yeah, okay. All right, you got the mic, so let him continue. And then,
right. Good evening, sir. You've talked a lot about the role of private industry and civil bureaucracy and how they can address these security imperatives. Can the people play a part in addressing these imperatives? And if so, what can we do? Thank you.
I think I tried my best to bring out the fact that there is a role here for academia, for industry, for individuals to play a part in this. But primarily, I would say that in the kind of industry that we are speaking of, defense manufacturing, definitely it's an area in which increasingly academia, our IITs, for example, our research institutions can play a role. So defense sector, I would say academia and industry even more than before. The private sector even more than before. The private sector so far has been kept out of it because it's that, make one kind of approach and also feeling that it's all too important to be left to, the wars are too important to be left to the generals alone. Perhaps diplomacy is too important, far too important to be left to diplomats alone. But defense manufacturing also is far too important to be left to, DPSUs alone. So we bring in the private sector, we bring in the individual here. And I think there is, growing space for that.
Good evening, sir. In one of your slides, you had mentioned a vision plan of 2028 in terms of the manufacturing capacity, where you said Rajnath
exports. 28 was in relation to 50,000 crores
correct.
Worth of exports. That's the target.
Yeah. So where do we stand now with reference to that target? Are we at
currently
10%?
We have exported 21,000 crores.
So that's a double, triple expansion.
The whole idea is to take it speedily up. And there are some green shoots here that give us optimism. I mean, you can't replicate that on a daily basis, but for example, the $375 million deal with the Philippines to sell your, cruise missile, the BrahMos, to the Philippines.
So would
not that you can sell a BrahMos to a Philippines every day, but there are lots of other systems that are being built, and hopefully we should get there.
So the existing equipment manufacturing companies, are we talking at a 2x growth or a 10x growth for that to happen?
Well, it's a rough calculation, isn't it? Like 2x from 21 to roughly 50. I mean, a little more than twice as much. Yeah. But now that you have that momentum and there is this focus of the past several years, probably we will be able to do it in a speedier manner.
Yeah, good evening, sir. Thank you for taking through the recent developments and our stake on recent developments in defense.
A little louder, please.
Yeah. So I was, just apart from the equipments and the troops. So I believe that the next warfare will be of the biology also. So what is India's take on that one, and what is the preparedness in that biological warfare?
Well, I don't agree that the next war could be a biological war. I mean, there's the Biological Weapons Convention. They had their review conference 2 years ago. And there is a regime in place. You cannot rule out, use of biological weapons or any weapon of mass destruction. But I think currently it seems that apart from aberrations that we might have seen in recent decades in terms of the Iran-Iraq war, for example, where biological weapons or chemical weapons were used, particularly by Iraq under Saddam on the Shias in the marshes to the south. I don't think we're looking at a situation like that. In fact, today there's greater focus on nuclear weapons because the moment Russia went into Ukraine, it put its nuclear weapons on alert. Mercifully, the United States did not do that. There's also renewed talk of the relevance of tactical nuclear weapons, theater nuclear weapons. There is also renewed focus as we speak because arsenals are growing. So I think it's come back a full circle. Like the mutual assured destruction era of the Cold War, the discourse is once again coming back to nuclear weapons because they are in my view, the ultimate weapon in terms of dissuading an adversary, in terms of deterrence capability. There is no comparison between biological weapons and nuclear weapons. I'm sure you'll agree with that. So we have a problem here because you have the United States renewing its nuclear weapons, modernizing them. Billions of dollars are being spent. The Russians have openly said that there is a nuclear dimension to what they might consider to be an existential threat. And an existential threat for Russia, for example, is linked to its definition of its geography. And that geography today includes the areas that they have annexed through legislation. And that includes, for example, not just Crimea, but the Luhansk and Donetsk part of Ukraine. So if you were to threaten that part, Russia might take recourse to nuclear weapons. That's the kind of broad messaging. Last 2 days, we've seen how the NATO chief has been speaking about the possibility of nuclear weapons being in play, potentially. You've seen how China's arsenal is growing faster than any other arsenal. So nuclear weapons are in currency even today as the ultimate deterrence. Biological weapons can be in play, but are not really meaningful enough, in my view, to prevent catastrophic wars of the type that can destroy humankind.
We'll go with the gentleman here.
Good evening.
Time, 7 minutes or so. We can take 2 more questions, and then we'll have to close. So you go ahead.
Hello, sir. So my question is, traditionally, India has always believed that Russia is in good relationship with us. But in the past decade or so, what we have seen is there's a growing fondness between China and Russia. So if there's a war breaking out tomorrow, how do you see Russia playing this one between the relationship between India and China? Thank you.
Personally, if you ask me, I don't see Russia as being involved. The Soviet Union was also not involved in 1962. Towards the end of the 1950s, after 59, despite the sort of rupture between the Soviet Union and Mao's China, the Soviets had not openly spoken out against China with regard to the India-China boundary question, except towards the very end, which of course mightily displeased the Chinese, because the Chinese expected the Soviet Union as a fraternal country,
ideological partners,
ideological brother, to come out in support of their position, which towards the end the Russians, the Soviets didn't do. But today, if there were friction or conflict between India and China, I wouldn't imagine the Russians would want to be directly involved, because they have enough chestnuts in the fire. They have their own fish to fry. I don't see what they would gain. We have good relations with them. Broadly speaking, they have been fairly supportive in terms of a linear trend over, say, the past 60, 70 years. The Soviet Union and then the legacy state of the Russian Federation have been broadly supportive of India. If you look at the use of the veto power, for example, in the UN Security Council, you will be surprised to see that very eminent, dignified countries for decades together prevented the Middle East from, the problem of the Palestinians from ever being resolved. You will see, notable countries there preventing any meaningful discourse on apartheid. And Ambassador Reddy has also served in South Africa. She would know a thing or two about that. So I don't think the Russians would be involved. I mean, they have no axe to grind with us, right? We have no bilateral issues. Right now, in fact, we seem to be buying a fair bit of oil from them. A trade was $10 billion. It's gone up to $60 billion. I was in Russia about a month ago, and I'm traveling next week also to Moscow for something. And I can tell you that there's still goodwill towards India. Just as we have an extraordinarily good relationship with the United States. We have a very good relationship with Russia also. So that's India for you, that we are able to transcend these differences among them. We're able to straddle these divides and talk to the Palestinians and the Israelis, or the Americans and the Russians at the same time, or the Iranians and the Saudis, broadly speaking.
Okay, we'll take one more after this and then try to close it. Is that all right, Ambassador?
Oh yeah, fine.
Two questions. One on your last slide on new wars. I didn't see much on information wars, and just like to hear your thoughts on that, and if there's any policy level measures the government's taking to address that. Second question, we've let the Chinese use Pakistan as a toothpick against us. Have we considered, or is there any thought on potentially using Taipei against them?
Your last bit, what was that?
Taipei, Taiwan, as you know, they get really jittery about their one China principle, and we seem to be, or just as everyone else is, towing the line on that. Have we ever attempted to use that?
I mean, very briefly, this is the era of disinformation, misinformation, and the internet and the social media platforms have lent themselves to this disarray. And as we enter the age of artificial intelligence, you'll see more of that, where you can actually do deep fakes of a type which you cannot distinguish from reality. So we are heading in that direction, but I think it's a broad challenge for everyone. It's a challenge for the most advanced of countries, and it's a challenge for countries of the global south as well. What I fear the most in an era of disinformation is a new kind of colonialism, and it's IT colonialism or AI colonialism, which will make it very difficult for countries to ever come out of it. And so that's a fearsome proposition. As far as tit for tat is concerned, and you seem to suggest that because the Chinese use Pakistan against us, we should use Taiwan. I want to make 3 or 4 broad points and then leave it to you to judge the rest. The first is that there is absolutely no difference between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, that is the so-called Republic of China, when it comes to their positions historically and traditionally on the India-China boundary dispute. So it's not as if the Taiwanese were in power today, in the whole of China, they would hand over everything to you. In fact, they have the same positions. The PRC inherited the ROC's positions with regard to the boundary dispute, with regard to Tibet, with regard to China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including the South China Sea. Remember that the 9-dash line is not an invention of the PRC. It is an invention of the Republic of China. In 1933, there was a geographer in Beijing. His name was Mr. Pai Mei-chu. Mr. Pai Mei-chu was a character. He believed that geography must be studied only in service of the nation, and that all cartography must be dedicated to love for the nation. So he was ready to invent lines. And he had been spooked by the fact that in 1925, when France was still a very big power in the South China Sea because of its presence in Indochina, a French captain by the name of Georges Meesmaker had started a voyage which took him to 9 different islands in the South China Sea. And on each of these, he planted the French flag. And this spooked Peiping at that time, not Beijing, as the ROC tend to call it, Peiping, was so spooked by this, the Zhongli Yamen, or the Foreign Office, that this geographer, Pai Mei-chu, became the busiest guy in town. In 1933, he started working on the 9-dash line, which became the official published map of China in 1936. You cannot use Taiwan against China, for you have limited capacities. What you have, you would rather use it in your first concentric circle, which is what I said, our continental borders and our maritime borders. And that really means the eastern and western Indian Ocean. That's where your core energies will be focused tomorrow on account of your availability of resources and primary interests. We do not have the same level of interest in either the South China Sea or the Pacific. And there is no guarantee that the game is worth the candle. Because if you were to use Taiwan, so to speak, are you suggesting that we have formal diplomatic ties with that country? Well, that's not likely to happen because the Taiwanese themselves find that as compared to, say, 25 years ago when they had 36 countries recognize them, today they have 11 countries recognize them. In the whole of the African continent, where there are 55 countries, according to the AU, for us it's 54, because we don't recognize the Sahrawi Republic. Anyhow, 55 countries, it's only Eswatini Swaziland, is that? Yeah, Eswatini, Swaziland that has diplomatic ties with Taiwan. None of the others have, and that's true of the Pacific, it's true of the Caribbean, it's true of the... So what exactly can we hope to do? You cannot suddenly de-recognize the People's Republic and start recognizing Taiwan. That's a chimera.
That's interesting revelation, actually. And I didn't know that. Nobody knew. Madam?
I'm going to ask for the proverbial last word, if I may. It's not a question. It's only to say, Sujan, that I'm very proud of what you've achieved, both as director of IDSA and also as in your long diplomatic career. And I knew when we worked together at the NSCS that you would go on to greater things, and your extremely in-depth knowledge of China has shone through in your presentation today and in the question and answer session. So I just wanted to end by congratulating you and saying that I hope you continue for a long time to head this organization and to contribute in whatever way you can to both to national security and to national defense, because India needs more people like you. Thank you.
So I guess no better words to end today's evening. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Yeah.